Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jerry Renaud. On this episode, Chad Hart discusses corn and soybean markets. Randy Pryor gives talks about wheat trends, Stephen Baenziger shares information about wheat varieties, and Paul Jasa explains how producers can increase their wheat stand consistency. Iowa State Extension economist Chad Hart is our market analyst this week. Warm weather continues to push corn and soybeans along. Monday's USDA crop progress report showed the majority of the nation's corn and soybean conditions to be rated good to excellent. Most states are reporting corn planting in the 90+% rate after a slow start in some places, and 72% has emerged. Soybean planting is moving along at a brisk pace. Since last week, farmers have planted another 10% of their crop. Soybean emergence has continued steady as well. Warm weather helped 21% of the nation's crop emerge since the last report. The crop is now 68% emerged, above the 5-year average of 52%. We talked with Chad on Wednesday morning about the latest news on corn and soybeans and began by asking him for his assessment of the latest crop progress report from the USDA.
Well, as you looked at the progress report, what it basically showed is as we start to really wrap up corn planting here, we're back up to about normal progress, over 95% of the corn crop planted across the country. We've seen about 2/3 of that emerge, and so we're back to around average. So we were behind. The warmer, drier weather helped us catch up, and so that put us on more normal progress. But it does bring up some issues as we look here. The warmer, drier weather, great for planting. Now we need to see it sort of turn around, get a little cooler, a little wetter to let that crop truly emerge and start to really grow on a good starting base. As you're looking at soybeans, the idea is that warmer, drier weather helped us get ahead of schedule here, and so we're running just a bit ahead, which is good considering we were looking at record plantings of soybeans across the country. And so, when we look at that planting progress thus far, what was a concern 2-3 weeks ago has now turned into, if you will, a little bit of strength as we're looking at the production side. And now we're looking at those crop conditions reports. They've started off fairly good. We're looking at, crops being rated in that 75 to 80% good to excellent range. So we're off to a great start, but we need Mother Nature to help us out a little bit to continue that good start rolling. If you go back and look at the drought monitor over this spring, we've always had a dry spot, especially as you look at the severe drought conditions down in, southwest Kansas, Oklahoma, into Texas. But we've seen a finger of that dryness reaching up through northern Missouri into southern Iowa, and that has remained in place even with the wetter conditions for the most part this spring. And so as we're getting where this crop's emerging and it's starting to truly try to grow, those dry spots are very sensitive here. So they've got, like I say, a good start. We've got it planted, we've got it emerged, but we definitely need some moisture to help boost that growth as we go through the first half of summer.
So there's nothing that's serious at this point in time, but you are issuing just a little bit of a warning to growers?
Yep, just a little bit of let's watch this as it develops here, because when we're looking here at the supply-demand conditions within the markets, USDA sort of changed their tune within the last couple of months and showing that, maybe demand is strong enough to catch up to production here. Well, if production is being even just a little bit limited by the weather conditions here, that could help improve prices as we move through the summertime.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about prices. Prices are still looking pretty good at this point.
Yeah, we're in pretty good shape. I mean, we have come down off some recent highs here. When I'm looking today, we're looking at new crop contracts still floating in at $4 on corn. Beans was hovering over, around $10.20. And so those are fairly strong prices for this time of the year, especially given the sizable production we've had over the last few years and with, like I say, the planting progress we've had so far this year. When we compare this year's prices to last year, cash-wise, we're running about 20 cents ahead of where we were at this time last year. So we are seeing some better prices out there. It is reflecting some really strong demand for our products, and that's been helping boost that. And that's one of the things as I'm watching right now is we've kind of got this pull between the weather conditions wanting to pull prices a little higher, and then let's call it trade concerns pulling prices a little bit lower. And so we're sort of teetering back and forth between those two things pulling on the marketplace.
Let's talk a little bit about the trade issues. Issues with both China and Mexico, I know, are a concern for a lot of people. What about you?
Definitely a concern there, and I'm going to throw Canada in the mix as well. When you're thinking about agriculture, we basically have a big three that we trade with, and that would be China, Mexico, and Canada. And we've got disputes with all three of them right now going on at the same time. So that is a major concern for agriculture, especially when we're talking about China, mainly talking about soybeans there, given the strong demand that they have. Basically, when you're looking at the Chinese market, that represents about 30% of the total U.S. soybean market. So that is a dramatic market to be having issues with right now. When you're thinking about Mexico, I want you to think mainly about corn, a little bit of soy, but pork would be the big issue as we look there, especially given this latest round of trade discussions concentrating on Mexico possibly putting in pork tariffs to offset the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs. And when you're thinking about Canada, I want you to think about that's just a broad mix of agricultural products that we trade with them. And with, let's call it the concern about how NAFTA was progressing even before this latest round of trade discussions, that is what brings Canada into the mix as far as, building on that dispute.
So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
We are in a wait-and-see mode here. It's been one of these deals where we've taken a step forward, next week we take a step back, and we seem to be bouncing back and forth as far as these trade negotiations are concerned.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to talk more about corn and soybean markets. This past week, the first wheat variety plot tour was held near Fairbury, Nebraska. This plot tour was sponsored by Nebraska Extension, and it was a golden opportunity for growers to get a chance to look at some new wheat varieties, along with varieties that have been mainstays for quite a while. Currently, winter wheat is 83% headed overall, and 49% of Nebraska's winter wheat crop is in excellent condition. One of the speakers at the tour was Nebraska Extension educator Randy Pryor. Market Journal producer Bridget Nelson had a chance to talk with Randy about the event and learned a little history of Nebraska's wheat production.
I've been an extension educator in southeast Nebraska here in Saline and Jefferson County area since 1982. So with that history, we used to have large wheat lines to the local elevators. Jefferson County would plant 49 to 50,000 acres of wheat. Today, or last year, according to the statistics, about 5,000. So we've seen a steady decline, no longer the wheat lines. In Saline County, similar trend. In Gage County, similar trend. So we have about 3,500 acres of wheat in Saline County. So it's actually a minor crop compared to what it used to be.
We further asked Randy why there has been a decline in wheat production.
So there's been a steady decline in wheat acres over the years. In 2015, we had a large scab outbreak in which farmers were compensated very little for their wheat crop. Last year, we had a large wheat crop, but low protein content, and so wide basis in the marketplace. So part of it has been cash flow has been a reason why we've seen a steady decline. But it's really unfortunate because wheat is such an opportunity crop. It's a great rotational crop for soil conservation. You can do soil conservation in the summertime after wheat harvest. Gives you a little cash flow in the summer, opposite of corn and soybean harvest. Gives you an opportunity to raise forage crops as a double crop. We see more people doing that now for soil health or for cattle. And and also an opportunity to apply manure. And so if you do no-till farming and you're doing cover crops, applying manure, I tell you what, it does make a difference. And in southeast Nebraska, we have low infiltration rate soils. So just like last night, we had a thunderstorm came through, gave us about an inch of rain. That was golden. We're standing in a no-till field, and there wasn't any runoff that came off of this field last night. In fact, we still have soil cracks in the ground. It's been very dry down here. We want to capture every drop we can. Wheat gives us that opportunity. But you have to cash flow it over a 3-year or maybe 5-year rotation, and that's helpful. And we need to use strategies for high yielding wheat strategies. And that's what it's all about with the tour tonight, with speakers talking about high yielding wheat.
Moisture, sunlight, and heat are all needed throughout the growing stages of wheat. Due to this year's cold spring weather conditions and the current dry weather in Fairbury, Nebraska, according to Randy, some of these wheat varieties may seem shorter than usual.
One of the things we noticed with the wheat this year in April, very cold conditions, and so the wheat was slower in development and it stayed shorter. You might notice that this wheat variety right here with the head right now is only knee high. We can still have high yielding wheat if we would get the moisture, the necessary moisture that's needed right now in a drought area. Being short, that inch of rain last night will really be helpful during head fill. Short wheat can still yield well if we get the adequate nutrition and moisture for it. This crop really advanced in the last 2 weeks with the heat and hot weather. You don't want hot weather during grain fill. And so it's really important that this June period, hopefully it won't be as hot and we'll get the adequate moisture that finishes the crop on out.
Next week, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Stephen Wagulo will share information about wheat stem sawfly. Also at the wheat tour was Nebraska University professor and wheat breeder Stephen Baenziger. At the wheat plot tour, participants are able to discover new knowledge and ideas on how to improve yield. Stephen says the goal of the tour is to give the growers honest information. He has faith in the growers' decisions that must be made based on all the conditions that go into that process. Market Journal was able to sit down with Stephen to get his thoughts on the tour and some of the new varieties that were on display.
Well, historically, wheat in southeast Nebraska and southwest Nebraska are the earliest wheats for the season. So these are where we would normally start our wheat tours, and this is literally the first one of the season. It's in southeast Nebraska. It's the wheat's headed out. We want the growers to see it when it actually has its heads out so they can take a look at it, get a feeling for how the wheats do, see it in an area which is close to where they're growing it, or they might want to grow it. And yeah, there's probably 25 varieties here. The varieties are, some are grown all the way across the state, some are specifically for this region, some are historic checks so we can see the progress we've made. Some are tried and trusted varieties that are workhorse varieties for the growers. And then of course, everybody wants to see what's new. And so we have new lines that maybe have been released a year ago, or ones that are still experimental lines that have never been released.
There were 31 different varieties of wheat for producers to compare at the Fairbury Wheat Field Day. Among those varieties, some are more popular than others.
Well, you know, probably in this trial, S.Y. Wolf is here. That's the most popular variety in the state. Then we would have the new one that we've released, which is Ruth, and it was named in honor of a very fine greenhouse manager who unfortunately died far too young. But it's well adapted here. It has an excellent yield record. The one prior to that was Freeman. It's done extremely well. You'll see varieties from Syngenta, you'll see varieties from Lima Grain. and also from Kansas State University, so we can compare, so the growers can pick and choose among all of the genetics that's available for this area.
By breeding different wheat varieties, producers are able to choose the perfect wheat that will produce the most yield based on specific environmental conditions.
Okay, there'd be a lot of genes that have changed historically. Historically, all of our wheats were tall. Now virtually all of them, especially for this area, are all semi-dwarfs. So that's one gene. Everybody breeds a little differently. So if you are in Kansas, they spend a little more time on leaf rust. They spend very little time on stem rust. Everybody spends time on stripe rust now. You may have a little more on fusarium head blight, a little less depending upon where you're being grown. But for this region, what we would like, the ideal wheat would have good leaf rust resistance, good stripe rust resistance. On the rare occasion when we get stem rust, we still highly recommend, there's no cost to it, so you might as well have it. It's like a great insurance policy, so you'd have stem rust resistance. For our millers and bakers, we'd recommend fusarium head blight. It can be quite devastating. All of these can be controlled with fungicides, but we don't want the growers to spend any more money on input costs than what they have to have.
To save money on input costs, wheat producers will also need to determine what the risks are during the growing stages of wheat. These risks include future weather patterns and disease outbreaks. Those who participated at the field day were able to learn how each of the 31 wheat varieties will respond to certain risks throughout the growing season.
What our goal to get across is to give the growers honest information, unbiased, so they can make the best possible decision for themselves. We have infinite faith in our growers making the right decisions. We think if we provide them the data, they can make the decision that fits their farm. And I guess the other thing we like to do on this is just to let them see what everything looks like. You know, we test on 15 farms each year. We probably have, before we release a line, 100 plus year locations or environments, but none of them are actually ever exactly the same one as a farmer's own field. So they need to make choices, get into the range of varieties that they would like to see, try them, keep their trusted ones, try a few new ones, see which ones make sense. If the trusted ones are still the best, they stay with them. If they see something that's new and very valuable, then they would try the new one.
The next Nebraska Extension Field Day of 2018 will be held on June 12th at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center located near Meade, Nebraska. This Wheat Pulse Field Day is free to attend and will cover information on wheat field peas, chickpeas, and lentils. You can register for all 2018 field days at go.unl.edu/wheatpulsefieldday. Ephemeral gullies are a common problem on the rolling fields of eastern Nebraska. Since the early 2000s, Dan Gillespie, an NRCS no-till specialist and farmer near Battle Creek, has taken steps to mitigate these issues by planting annual waterways of the cover crop cereal rye. After realizing the benefits of having green living roots growing in the soil throughout the year, Dan further decided to plant whole fields to cover crops. You can learn more about Dan Gillespie's tips for addressing ephemeral gully erosion in the June edition of Nebraska Farmer. According to Nebraska Extension engineer Paul Jasa, it does make a difference in how you plant wheat. We met with Paul at the wheat tour to learn more about ways to increase wheat stand consistency.
Well, when it comes to seeding wheat, some producers get concerned that their stand isn't as good as they'd hoped. When it comes to putting seed in the ground, we have to think about our seeder, whether it be an air seeder or a box drill. But we got to think about some main concepts. One is we're going to cut and handle residue. We've got a lot of no-till production now, or conservation till. We've got residue on top of the soil surface. Disc opener drills, single disc or double disc, is an effective way to do that now. Second step we got to do is get the seed down on the right seeding depth. Too often wheat is seeded too shallow. People call it dusting in, they're going to wait for rain. I'd rather put it down into moisture. And it depends upon the wheat variety itself, but I like to plant my wheat 2.5 inches deep. Too many people put it in about 1 inch deep since it's such a small seed, but at 2.5 I know I'm in good moisture. The third thing is I gotta get good seed to soil contact. Moisture has to get into the seed so I can get it up and growing. And so a good firming wheel or something to get that seed to soil contact. Now the firming wheel may also close the seed V. I call that a fourth step. We got a lot of air seeders out there now that'll have a firming wheel that packs the seed into the soil and then an angled wheel behind that actually closes the seed V. And if we think about those steps as separate steps, we can identify strengths or weaknesses of any seeder out there, whether it be the air seeder or the box drill. Think of them separately, then change, adjust as you need.
As Paul mentioned, the second step of increasing your wheat stand consistency is to make sure your seed is planted deep down into the soil. By following this step, the wheat roots will be able to obtain the most nutrients and moisture within the soil.
Well, when it comes to the different steps I just listed, seeding deeper, we'll set the crown deeper into the soil. As we get the crown a little deeper in the soil, we're going to be a little more resistant to winter kill. We'll get a better root system developed. That better root system will get that better water and nutrient uptake. And that's why I like to put that wheat seed in a lot deeper. You'll have to look at what we call the coleoptile rating on the wheat seed itself. Most of the wheats we raise in Nebraska have a medium to long coleoptile, so I can go ahead and seed them deeper. But the other thing is, when I say I want good seed to soil contact, I've seen too often where some of the drills are a little bit too lightweight, not enough pressure to actually firm the soil around the seed. And when it comes to no-till conditions in particular, I'm going to have to add some weight to those drills and air seeders just to make sure I got enough total weight to get the opener in the ground and enough weight left over to get the tire to press the seed into the soil.
In addition to making sure the seed is pressed into the soil, row spacing can also influence wheat production.
Well, when it comes to our stands of wheat itself, several times we get questions, what's the best row spacing, for instance, for wheat? 7.5 inch row spacing like we have here in these plots. 10 is fairly common. You got western Nebraska, you see some 12 and even some 15. What happens as the row spacing gets wider, our weed control has to be pay attention to it, because narrow row spacing does shade the soil, so we have less weed pressure there. Now the narrow row spacing spreads the wheat seeds further apart within the row for the same population. So when it comes to interplant competition, that's actually an advantage. We can get too many plants in a row, say if we're on a 15-inch row spacing and we're trying to get a higher population. And so again, when it comes to getting that seed in the ground, the right depth, a good root system, row spacing enters into it as well. But I still like to go a little deeper. Now traditionally out west, we had the hoe drills. The hoe drill was a tine that basically sprinkled the seed behind the tine. They had to have the wider spacing just to let room for residue to go flow through there. As we go to the disc drills, like all the new drills are, we can go those narrower spacing, get those seeds spread out a little bit more within the row, and get a little more root system that's independent from the neighbor.
Healthy wheat growth is determined by how the seed is planted. But when it also comes to increasing wheat yield, the seed itself can determine the overall results.
When we think about wheat seeding, we have to make sure we got good quality seed. I know other people will talk a lot about what we have for seed, but when you consider, like, any time we're putting a seed in the ground, that's the best yield potential you have is that day. Anything that happens after that, yield goes down. So if I start with a poor quality seed, poor yield potential, I can never improve it. So you start with good quality seed, get it placed properly, and get those plants up and growing.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. And during this last week, of course, we dealt with that significant severe weather event that happened last Friday into Saturday morning, where we had the derecho type event, basically a long line of thunderstorms with very heavy wind move from northeast Nebraska through eastern Nebraska and then exit out during the early morning hours. And we had wind speeds clocked anywhere from the 60 to 85 mile-an-hour range at the peak of the intensity of the storms. And then we did see a brief lull in the activity until we got into the midweek period, and we've seen thunderstorm redevelopment as the systems pushed around the periphery of the ridge that was bringing the heat to our region. We actually seen some significant severe weather in the Panhandle and also up into portions of east central Nebraska, particularly just to the north of Columbus and over toward the Missouri River, and of course a scattering of precipitation. And we did see some good rainfall across eastern Nebraska, but not to the point where we feel confident enough in the areas that we depicted last week as being abnormally dry or in moderate drought to see improvements. So hopefully as we get into next week, a couple more precipitation chances that are in the forecast will pan out, and we'll see some improving conditions. So as we go to the upper air models, what we are looking for today is that we do have an upper air trough to our west with a high pressure ridge at the surface and in the upper atmospheres, keeping the heat to our south. We're on the northern periphery of that, so we are expected to be in the 90s for most of Nebraska. Surface low depicted basically in western Kansas. That is going to allow moisture to lift up and interact with the systems move around the periphery of the ridge, bringing some thunderstorm activity to South Dakota and northern Nebraska. As we get into Sunday, that trough starts to move inward toward the northern Rockies. Surface low pressure indicated in the Dakotas and in northwestern Kansas. That is going to lift the moisture up as that warm front starts to build its way toward the Great Lakes. So we're going to see convection from northeast Nebraska all the way through the eastern Corn Belt. And as we get into Monday, this trough starts to move across the northern plains. We do indicate surface low is expected to develop in the western South Dakota. That should allow for some thunderstorm activity to continue across the northern plains and into the upper Great Lakes region all the way through the eastern Corn Belt. And then as we get into Tuesday, this low pressure system or trough will move toward the Great Lakes, bringing much cooler conditions into our region for a couple days. We'll be back down into the 80s for most of the state, which will be right within normal to slightly below normal as most of the precipitation stays well to our east. Now as we get into the day on Wednesday, we start to see the ridge building back in, so warmer conditions start to move into western Nebraska, but we'll still be under the influence of cool high pressure across eastern Nebraska, although we will see some moderation of temperatures closer to the upper 80s. Most of the precipitation will remain to the south. It was at the very southern portion of that high pressure system. And then as we get into Thursday, we start to see the ridge build back in. The heat starts to lift up from Texas. We are looking at low pressure developing over central Texas. That is going to start to feed moisture to the north. But most of the activity, once again, will be confined to our south, and that will keep most of the moisture out of our region until we get into Friday, when this trough starts to make its inroads into the northern plains and northern Rockies. We'll see surface low pressures developing in the western Dakotas and to our south across northern Texas and Oklahoma. We should see two distinct areas of thunderstorms to our south and one right to the north as that starts to push southward, bring us increasing chance of precipitation next weekend. 8 to 14 day forecast next Thursday through the following Tuesday, below normal temperatures for the northern plains and above normal precipitation.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, wheat trends, wheat varieties, and how producers can increase their wheat stand consistency. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to discuss corn and soybean markets and give his analysis of the June USDA WASDE report. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jerry Renault. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.